And the way this sermon is set up, we go through what's called an expository style, which means you need to have your Bible open. And here he was up here preaching this past Sunday. I didn't have my Bible with me. So you know what I did? I got the one that I have on my phone. I got on my Bible app and read it. A lot of you didn't know that that's what I was doing. I think a lot of you thought I was checking out Facebook or something like that. I want you to know, I see a lot of y'all with those too, and I've always thought you were looking at the Bible. But I apologize to Torch for all appearances of being disinterested or disrespectful. I actually wish to recall very much of his message, introducing this week's message. But thank you for pointing things out to me. I'm serious. I only fought one strike to one person who I thought was inappropriate. I think everyone else did that in a tremendous sense of love. I'm not into being condemnatory or anything like that. And so I don't like it when people treat me that way. But you can do that to me. And I thank you for it. Okay? Now, I imagine that my actions gave permission to every kid in this place, maybe even every teenager, to mess with phones. Okay? So I'll tell you what, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If I see one out, I'll invite you up to read the Bible from it. If you want to play it safe, go paper. Torch did preach one fine message to us last Sunday, and it was about the first chapter of Jonah. This week's message is on the second chapter of Jonah. Guess what next week's message is on? You might want to jump ahead and read it after this message. And then, of course, the last Sunday of the month will be the fourth chapter of Jonah. The Torch preached on the first message, on the first chapter. He did a fine job telling us a story about the guy who, I love the way Torch put it. He said, it's about Jonah, but it's about me, and it's about you, it's about us. We all have that tendency. There's at least one compartment in our lives that wants to kind of run away from God and His plan for us. There's some pocket of resistance. You might know of it. I'm aware of it in me. That part of me that just wants to kind of burn through devotions without letting sink in. Or that part of me that wants to push back against authority. All of us have something. All of us, if we're brutally honest, have a handful of things that runs from God. And Torch did a great job telling us about how Jonah ran down to the coast and took a ship far away, 180 degrees the opposite direction of where God had told him to go. But he didn't get away from God's presence, and God sent the storm, and when it was all said and done with, he was thrown overboard, and the crew that threw Jonah into the drink became believers in the one true living God. We know the story after that. I love the way Torch said that too. He said, a lot of people make this a story about a fish. And he said, it's not a story about a fish. He said, it's a story about a man inside a fish. And I appreciate that too. I've met people before who have said, goodness, if it was a fish, how would Jonah have gotten oxygen for those 3 days? If it was a fish, how would Jonah have survived decompression limits and things like that? If it was really a fish, how would Jonah have survived within a digestive system? And that's why I like the passages before us. It says, now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. It was something the Lord provided. Is this cut down? No? Okay, you let me know. Okay. This is something that the Lord provided for Jonah. doesn't mean that it's some biological species that has already been registered into the university system. It means it was provided just for a task, just for this situation. And so maybe it didn't involve decompression limits. Maybe it didn't involve oxygen issues. Maybe it didn't involve digestion issues. It was something that God provided. So Torch is right. It's not a story about a fish. It's a story about God's provision. And it's a story about a man that was inside of a fish that was God's provision. And it's a story about a God who provided provision that would take in a man. And with that going forward, let's talk about God's provision, because let's admit it, provision showed up. Not in the shape that Jonah would have liked. Certainly not in the form or the shape that Jonah or the crew of the boat expected. What showed up was God's provision. Here was Jonah thrown overboard into rough and turbulent sea. All the mass and swirling confusion. The whole idea of being far away from land. The whole idea of taking in all that is involved in being thrown overboard in turbulent water. Here's Jonah in the midst of it. And what does he do? He experiences God's provision. And again, I would be threatened by that. I would be scared by that. I would think God's judgment would be even harsher on me. But with this in mind, we have to ask, what must it be like to be consumed by that which the Lord has provided? What must it be like to be taken in, consumed, gulped by that which the Lord has provided? Think about that with me, because that's what's going on with Jonah. And taken in by God's provision, God's provided vessel. This provided just for the occasion fish. We read of a big transition, a big transformation that takes place in Jonah. We see him go from somewhere weak to somewhere strong. We see him go from somewhere rebellious to somewhere compliant. And my guess is, when you're inside the quarters of a fish, there's not a whole lot to do except for to own up to some things and maybe communicate with the one who provided the fish. The second chapter of Jonah is just that prayer. What Jonah prayed while he was inside the Lord's provision, while he was inside the fish. Now, there's an entire chapter worth of scriptures, and I usually invite you to read these scriptures with me, but because there are so many and because we're going to have to stop and go, I'm going to read them for you. But these are the words that Jonah recalled. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. Again, nothing else to do. Pray. You have something to do? Pray. While you're doing it, pray. Inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, in my distress, I called to the Lord. He answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You sure this isn't skipping out on me? Okay, because it seems that way to me. Maybe this is wrong. Okay.
Now you did.
Now I did? But Bruce, help me out over here. I'm going to preach this in the old-fashioned way, okay? I'm going to preach this the old-fashioned way. In my distress, I called to the Lord. You hear that? While he was swirling in waters that were storm-tossed, while he was being pushed about by waves and driven asunder by waves, what did he do? He called out to the Lord, and the Lord comes along to answer. And he saw himself going to the grave. He saw himself going to death, but something in his heart knew it wasn't too late. He could call out to God, and calling out to God is what he did, and he found the listening ear of God. Even at the brink, even at the edge of death. Jonah prayed on, you hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight. Yet I will look again toward your holy temple. I wonder if you've been in the kind of place, I doubt we've been to the kind of place physically that Jonah knew of then. But I wonder if spiritually you've been in a similar kind of place where you sit there and thought, my gosh, God has been patient with me. But I've been rebellious, I've stepped aside, I've broken rules, I've broken laws, I've sinned, I've been all over the place, I've been inconsistent. God can forgive me, but man, there's got to be a limit on that forgiveness at some point. At some point, he just has to hang it up and just write me off as irredeemable. Maybe you've played that tape in your mind. Maybe you've heard that said in your heart before or in your mind. And maybe that voice sounded a lot like your own, maybe a lot like your own inner self-critic. Let me tell you whose voice it really is. It's the enemy's. It's Satan's. That one that's committed to trying to wreck our relationship with God. To see that it's... Hello? To see that it gets sidetracked, turned off some way or another. And recognize it for what it is, resist it, and he will flee. Now, even while Jonah was feeling condemnation, while he was condemning himself, he said, I will continue to look toward your holy temple. I'll continue to look toward you, God. I'll continue to look in all godliness. The engulfing waters, he went on to pray, threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, you, Lord my God, Lord my God, you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. Do you see a shift going on? Do you see a shift going on? There's a shift going on. This is one of those subtle ways the battle's fought. Seriously. There's a shift. Jonah's feeling bad for himself, for his own unrighteousness, for his own rebellion, for the fruits of his own decisions that he made. He's going to quit blaming God all of a sudden, start taking responsibility for himself, starting to turn toward God now, starting to turn toward obedience, starting to see the transition of him being a poor, pitiful victim to one who's being redeemed, one who's being taken from the pit. But you, Lord, my God, brought my life up from the pit. He took my feet from the miry clay, right? So says the Psalms. And set me firmly on the rock. No longer is this a story the torch pointed out time and again last week about how there was this sinking sensation. We've even seen the first part of Jonah's prayer, but now we see a rising. We see it being brought up. We see a deliverance. We see something really wonderful that shift is happening. That tide, if you will, it is turning in Jonah's life. The Lord bringing my life up from the pit. Now I believe that if I could pass this microphone around, we could say it in ways great and small, and emotional, and maybe even a whisper of how we've experienced God taking our life out of the pit. Our God is no stranger to the pit. He's met some wonderful people there. They might not have felt very wonderful while they were there, but He brought them up out of it and showed them His wonder. And what an important thing, what a beautiful thing that is. Jonah goes on to pray, when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord. And my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. And again, prayer is where so much of that communication takes place. Where that relationship is celebrated and is dynamic. Those who cling to worthless idols, prayed Jonah, those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. And I want to isolate those words from His prayers too. Because I know we all know the 10 Commandments, and one of them says we shouldn't be worshiping idols. And I go to a driveway Bible study every Tuesday night. We've been talking for 2 weeks now, 3 weeks, on Israel worshiping the golden idol. 3 weeks talking about that. We might tend to say, well, no, we kind of moved beyond idolatry. We don't make statues and dance around them like they did in the ancient times. But if you listen to the guys I Bible study with, they'll tell you that's probably the one that we break the most. We tend to make idols of our dreams and our plans and our goals. I'm all for dreams, plans, and goals. I am not for idolizing them. Godly plans, dreams, and goals bring glory to God. Our selfish ones bring glory either to ourselves or something else. We tend to treat those dreams, goals, and desires as gods unto themselves, thus idols unto themselves. They rob God and His loved ones of our attention, of our devotion, of our time, of our resource, and of our essence. And Jonah nails it. If we cling to that, compared to the love of God, whatever we're idolizing will prove worthless compared to the love of God.